Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. Now, U.S. President Donald Trump has revoked his earlier endorsement of the G7 joint statement just hours after leaving the meeting of G7 leaders. His action comes in response to what he calls Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's false statements at a closing news conference. Trump had described Mr. Trudeau as dishonest and weak. The U.S. president made his thoughts known in a series of tweets he issued from Air Force One just as Canada released the joint statement. According to the U.S. president, quote, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of Canada acted so meek and mild during our G7 meetings, only to give a news conference after I left saying that U.S. tariffs were kind of insulting and he will not be pushed around. End of quote. Says very weak and dishonest. Now joining us to discuss this and everything G7 is Arise Chief Correspondent Dan Warren. Welcome to the morning show.
Thank you very much indeed.
Great to have you here.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so can you just break down everything that has happened with the G7, because it is one minute we think, oh, these powerful leaders around the world are having a meeting, they're going to move the world forward, they're going to have like a joint communique, all of that. The next one person is like an outlier,
and then asking for a G7 plus one.
Yes,
yes,
well,
so
I think I mean, there was always, what was unusual about this year's G7 is the fact that nobody was really talking about it. They were saying, oh, Donald Trump's got this thing to go to before he goes to Singapore, because the Singapore summit has just taken the sort of the limelight, so to speak. And there was clearly going to be a few fireworks, because there was always discussions over trade that the other six didn't agree what the US was doing. Yeah. But the fact before it even started for President Trump to say, I think Russia should be involved. that didn't clearly go down well with people like Theresa May, who's clearly not an ally of Russia so much. But then Trump's reasoning, and then you start to think, well, actually, yes, there is something very presidential about this. He's saying we've got a world to run. Now, we might not all get on, we might not all like each other, but essentially we must run the world, and we must have cross-sections from the world. Interesting, he didn't say, well, a country in Africa should appear. He did pick, so he was very selective. So that obviously caused a lot of friction, and from what the reports we're getting is that it was 6 against 1. But this one person, this very powerful person, is dominating the headlines of what came out. I mean, there was even discussions that he might not have even bothered showing up, because nobody... he just didn't actually see it as that big event, whereas normally the G7 is where...
It's a huge event.
Yeah, exactly.
Stephanie was saying earlier, there were reports about him attending meetings late, leaving early, and then we had that picture as well of him just being like very standoffish, like, so it was almost like he did not want to be there. You know, but what would you say the major outcome of the G Summit?
I think the major outcome is the fact that unilateralism and the fact that the West is clearly split in many ways. No one actually wants to say, no, America, you can't do that, because America is so powerful, and every country wants to be America's main ally. You know, like the UK always go, oh, we have a special relationship. France, you know, there was a special relationship. In fact, it was only a month or so ago that Macron was, you know, hugging him and kissing him live on stage. You know, now they're sort of trading Twitter insults. So I think that the problem is that the West aren't brave enough to stand up to the big brother, really, that, you know, and to a degree they could be seen getting bullied, but Donald Trump got elected basically on his America First mandate, and he's actually doing, bizarrely, what he said he would do, and people are saying, how dare he do that? But for once, a politician is actually doing what he said. So he can't, as much as people criticize him for some of his policies, and I think the way he delivers, actually, for what he's saying, is exactly what his manifesto was. And I always think that there's a lot of, obviously, history and heritage with the G7, and I honestly think that they thought he would back down, and we go back a long way. Canada's our closest neighbour, but he is adamant that it's America first. And now we're seeing Russia and the Russian President Vladimir Putin and China's Xi Jinping. They've got their own Shanghai Cooperation and they've invited Iran, and there they seem to be unified. And it seems that, you know, the West is split, the East is growing. Things are certainly changing in this world.
Yeah, no, definitely. They are changing. And I think everything is becoming very politically incorrect because we're so used to presidents and prime ministers speaking so politically correct, where you don't say things like, oh, you're very dishonest and weak.
And meek and mild.
I mean,
you don't, normally you would have a press briefing.
Yes.
Well, Trump uses Twitter for his,
tweets.
and he believes that it should be his supporters that know what he's thinking first before the press. So he's broken down all these boundaries, and as much as like him or loathe him, he has changed politics for the future now, because as you said, people will now start trading insults because it seemed to be more accepted now.
But from this G7 summit, what does this mean for the rest of the world? The West being divided, especially Africa. Let's bring you on. What does this mean for Africa, for Nigeria?
I think Africa's certainly got a huge opportunity if the Africa Union can stop squabbling, because there's been similar issues in the Africa Union as there is in the European Union where they can't agree, and actually grow up and start pitching. Because, I mean, President Macron has even suggested, why don't we have the G6 now and tell the US off you go. And then, Africa can start pitching to these organisations or even create their own one. But the problem is it's just too much squabbling in the continent because everybody wants to be number one. And, there can only be one number one. And I mean, admittedly, as they, each country takes a turn at being ahead of it, it's a vast continent, so many heads of states, ego is going to clash. But eventually, people are getting sick and tired of going around in circles. Now, if we look at something like Brexit, the UK is looking for so many trading partners. This could be a key time for Africa and Nigeria. And I know the Foreign Secretary of the UK, Boris Johnson, has been in Nigeria and saying, we're ready to trade with them. But again, stop the squabbling and just get on with it. And I think the leaders over here are not helping themselves. I think that's safe to say.
They're not looking at the bigger picture. I think is the problem most of the time. It's
exactly, because I mean, like Rome wasn't built in a day, and like trade agreements. I remember the EU and Canada took about 7 years just to complete one trade agreement. So these things do take a lot of time, and obviously people want to see instant results, and voters want to see instant results. When someone's fighting an election and they say they're going to change X, Y, and Z, they expect the day after the election for it to be all changed, and that is impossible. So I think it is being realistic with timeframes, but at the same time, 7 years to do one trade deal, that's just inexcusable. That's just bureaucracy gone mad. So I think that all of these organisations need to shape up and just be sensible, because essentially I think half the problem is people making these decisions are even not democratically elected. They're like the EU, for example. That's one reason why, one of many reasons why Britain decided to vote for Brexit. But like the EU was on talks on the G7, and there's a question about, well, the EU is 27, 28 nations. How can they be on it? So the EU, who are the two leaders there, not elected, people eventually will rise against it, and that is what's happened in the United States. People were fed up. Everyone thought Hillary Clinton would win, and we're seeing some events around the world, like, for example, Singapore. There was a good debate I was watching yesterday, is if she was president, it's unlikely that this olive branch.
And that's the next thing we're going to talk about, but we have to go on a break now. When we come back, Dan Warren will still be here with us. Don't go away.